and welcome to video 3 of the baby dragon quilt along. The first video, I posted a ton of blocks because they were all very similar. The second video, I posted a handful of blocks. Third video, I'm only posting 4 more blocks. I'm gonna try to do this more often. The sort of theme of this video, or what I wanna focus on, is when we get into blocks that need to be separated into different sections. This is what the blocks look like when you print them out. So we're gonna cut right along the middle there. So we have 2 separate blocks. And there's only one that has separate sections. So this is like your intro to separate sections. I have 2 different systems for how my quilt patterns are labeled. One is a color coding system and one is a system that's black and white. And the idea there is that there's an option for people who maybe don't have a color printer or don't want to use all the color in the color printer. I prefer the color coded system because I feel like I can see it better. I chose to make this particular pattern in my black and white system just to make it more accessible. The solid lines, as we learned in some other videos, is where you're going to be sewing seams. The dashed lines, which if you look closely on some places will actually have little scissors. The dashed lines are where you're going to cut. So it's not always possible for everything in a block to be done as one section. So when it needs to be, and I try to avoid that because it makes it more complicated, but when it needs to be split, this is how we would do it. So here's an example of our block that has 3 separate sections. And the sections are labeled with a square or rectangle that's rounded. We learned before that this letter and number that's in the square, that tells you what block you're working on and where that block is in the grid. So the rows are labeled with numbers, the columns are labeled with letters. When we look at this one, again, we have the letter and number in the square. That's what block this is and where it is in the quilt. But the one in the rounded square, that's the order the sections are sewn in. So this is section 1, this is section 2, this is section 3. That means you have to sew all the pieces on section 1 and 2, then you can sew section 1 and 2 together. And then once you've sewn them together, then you can sew section 3. There are some times where this order could be done in any order. This block really could be done in any order. But there are times when the order does matter, where we might have, like, in some blocks you might have 1A and 1B and then 2. And that means that 1A and 1B have to be sewn together before you can sew them to 2. Whereas here, I could sew 1 and 2 together and then sew 3, or I could sew 3 and 2 together and sew 1. It really doesn't matter. So I'm going to cut along these lines and try to cut as straight as possible. So now you see you have 3 separate sections. So I'm going to sew all the different pieces onto here, and then we're going to trim them, and then we're going to sew them back together. So you'll notice that when I do this, we have the seam allowance drawn on the outside of the block. We do not have a seam allowance right here. There are a few reasons for that. One reason is if I draw these as separate pieces and draw a seam allowance everywhere, you go through a whole lot more paper because you basically need twice as many pages in your quilt. The second reason is, although it seems like it would be challenging to line these up without having the seam allowance on the paper so that you can see it, I'm going to show you how to match them up and sew them back together. And then when you do that, what that means, there is no paper in the seam, which makes it less bulky and easier to pull the papers out when you're done with the quilt. So here's my new Bernina, like her eyes. So we decided to name her Queen Bee. She's beautiful. We're going to start with section 1. And so if we look at my first piece here, A, L, C, my second piece, B, PC. LC is this color and PC is this color. Now you'll notice that AC is sort of irregularly shaped. Sometimes when I get an irregularly shaped piece like that, I'll just cut a rectangle that looks like it's about that size. Actually, you see I was extremely generous here. And then this is more like the shape that's going to fit here. In the beginning, okay, when you first start a block and you have A and B, you can either put B here and then have A flip, or basically what I'm saying is A and B are interchangeable. So I could put the yellow fabric behind A, and then when I put my B fabric on, it would have to be face down and it would flip. So whatever one you're flipping, make that the less difficult one. So the fact that this is a more weird shape, I'm going to have that piece be A and then flip the yellow fabric. I'm gonna make sure that the right side of the fabric's facing out. And then when I put the B fabric down, it needs to be right side facing down. Now I grab my next section. A is this big S piece, which is silver, and B is another LC piece. Also, when you have an A and a B and you can choose which one goes against the paper, I would also choose either the most irregularly shaped or the largest. It's gonna be the easiest. So I have my large piece there. Here's the piece that's B. Now when you're about to start a piece, I will always put my needle down and then I'll lift the paper up and I'll make sure the fabric is lined up and I'll make sure that that fabric goes out 1/4 of an inch from the line. Here's our other piece. A is S and B is LC. I cut a piece that was like insanely too large. Got my B piece. Also, when I'm putting my needle down, I'm putting my needle down 1/4 of an inch behind this line. I sort of talked about this in the last video. Well, I talked about this in the last video as far as going past this way, but when I'm starting, I don't want to start right there. I want to start behind that because this is going to cover it. So you always want to start 1/4 of an inch behind where the line starts. That's where I'm going to put my needle down. And then I'm going to look at, do I have 1/4 of an inch of extra fabric all around here for the first piece? And then when I look at the second piece, is this going 1/4 of an inch past the line? So right now, since I'm just showing you this block, I'm going to cut off the first piece that we did. I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to trim. So we only have 1/4 of an inch fabric from where that seam is. And then I'm gonna iron or press. I'm gonna press. Put my clapper down. And now I'm gonna go and get the next piece. Same thing, flip it over, trim it if needed. That one looks pretty good. Then I'm going to press this one. Put the clapper down. Okay, now here's our piece number 1. Like I said, you can try to cut the pieces as close to the sizes you want, or you can do like I do and just cut way too much and then save the scraps. If you're ever unsure, before you do the next piece, if you hold this up to a window, you can usually see through where the fabric is, and you just want to eyeball to make sure that you have about 1/4 of an inch fabric around whatever pieces you've done. So I've done A and B, so I just want to make sure that that goes past A and B. Now C here is PC, so I'm going to cut a little piece for C. This piece is going to go here. So I need to start with it like this so that it flips over like that. I'm going to place it so that it has 1/4 of an inch of fabric sticking out past the edge of the paper and 1/4 of an inch of fabric coming in past where I'm going to sew the seam. And then I'm going to lift it up. Look where that line is. And I'm going to line the fabric up so that it's 1/4 of an inch away from this line. Now I'm going to get my other piece from the back here, flip it, trim it, and press it. Put the clapper on it. All right, now here's our other piece. Here we have piece A and B. So we'll get C, it says it's PC, so we need a little triangle of this. It's pretty triangle-like. And then I'm gonna place it so it goes 1/4 of an inch out from that line. And I'm gonna lift it up and make sure the fabric's 1/4 of an inch out from that line as well. I'm gonna keep doing this until I've done all of the sections. Here's a little trick I want to show you guys. If you're just sort of cutting willy-nilly like I like to do and not measuring exactly, sometimes I'll cut a piece and I'll iron it over and then I'll realize it doesn't quite fit. If you kind of look at this through the light, you can see that this fabric is just about meeting this line, but it needs to go 1/4 of an inch past that. When that happens, I don't pick it out and do it over again. I'll just add another piece of fabric. If I just take another piece of fabric that's the same and line them up, then when I iron this over, we'll have enough. Now, I know that that makes a seam here, but I don't really care about extra seams. A lot of times my patterns are so complex and I have so many seams that no one would know there wasn't supposed to be a seam there anyways. And you can always redo it if you want to, but I like to keep a lot of little scraps. Like here are some scraps. I would keep these in a Ziploc bag labeled with what color they are. So then when I get to spots that have small pieces like this, I can just go dig through my scrap bag and find a scrap that fits it. And that way I get the most out of my fabric. So now here's an example of one of the sections, the block that was 3 sections, and I've sewn all the pieces on. And I know it looks like crazy random right now. In the video previously, I showed you that I basted the outside. I also do that when it's separate sections. I find it's very helpful. What you're gonna wanna do, you're gonna wanna turn your stitch length up to basically as long as your machine will go. So for me, that's a 6. And I'm gonna stitch right in the seam allowance here. Now here where there is, it's just the edge and there's no seam allowance that's drawn on, I just leave that. So here we have another piece that's completed and it's a little different because it's the inside piece. I still want to baste these outsides. So I'll baste one and then I'll go to the other side and baste the other side. So now I'm gonna trim these pieces. So here we have our sections. I'm gonna trim these sections. When I showed you a whole block, what we would do is we would take the ruler and we would line the line up with that inside line. And then you can see that the dashed line lines up at the edge of the ruler. What's different about these blocks is that because I have no seam allowance here, all I'm gonna do is I'm going to take that first line on my ruler, that's 1/4 of an inch, and I'm gonna line it up with that dashed line. And there's my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So you can see how I don't really need the paper there. Look how nice it looks once it's trimmed. On this one, we have 2 sides without paper, so I'm just lining my ruler up with that dashed line. So inside the block, you're lining the ruler up with the dashed line. And for the outside of the block, you're lining it up with the solid line. Now look, you have section 1 and section 2 with the extra fabric. Let's cut section 3. Now we have section 1, section 2, and section 3. Now we're going to sew them together. How we sew these together is actually relatively simple. Let's do section 1 and 2. So actually, let's just flip these over real quick so you can see this is what the block's going to look like. But we got to sew these seams together. We're going to take section 1, section 2, fabric sides together, paper sides out. Make sure that the lettering on the 2 are both facing the same direction, so they're both facing up. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this point right here. I'm gonna take a pin, and right where the edge of the paper meets the outline of the block, I'm gonna poke the pin through. And then coming from the back, I wanna try to poke the pin through that same spot on the other block. So where this line meets the edge of the paper. Now, I know that my 2 blocks are lined up here. Now I'm gonna do the same thing on the bottom. So where the outline of the block and the edge of the paper meets, I'm gonna poke my pin through. And then coming from the other direction, I wanna try to get my pin lined up with that line and the edge of the block. Now I have pins holding it in place, so I'm gonna sew it. I'm gonna hold these 2 together and I'm gonna pull this pin so the top of the pin all the way at the edge of the paper. I'm gonna hold both of them until I see it's lined up. And then what I'll do is holding those papers together with my thumb, I'll sort of poke the edge of the pin through the paper so that it stays in place while I put the needle down. Once I have the needle down, I can pull that pin out. And then before I sew, I'm gonna grab this pin and I'm gonna look at these edges to make sure they're lined up. And then I'm gonna hold on to both of those as I start to sew. Now, when you're doing this, it's a little bit different because when we're sewing these pieces, we're sewing on the line. But when you sew these two sections together, you don't actually want to sew on that line. You want to sew just to the right of the paper. You don't want to leave a space between the edge of the paper and what you're sewing, but you also don't want to sew into the paper because that will make the section actually smaller than it's supposed to be. So now when I'm getting close to where my pin's going to be, I like to have my pin like this because if you hold it sideways, it might push the fabric one way or the other. So I like to hold it like this for most of the sewing. Then when I'm getting close, I'll move the pin over a little bit. And then when I get about to where the pin's going to be, I'm going to pull the pin out. If you look closely, you can see how close to the paper the seam is. If you check both sides, then you can make sure, like if you look right here, I almost started sewing into the paper. It's close enough, it's fine. But if you're sewing into the paper on one side, not the other side, that means it wasn't lined up. And I did a pretty good job. So when you have things like this, if you sew it perfectly, you should see that your seams are lining up. This one was not perfect, but I'm just not that picky. If you have a really important seam you want to make sure it lines up, then you can actually do a pin on each side, and you could also do a pin in the middle. If you put the pin in right where that line is, and then find the same line on the other side, and that way you'll know it'll match. So now I'm gonna press this, and when you press it, there are lots of varying opinions about whether or not you should press it open or to the side. I think I'm gonna press this one open. I learned to press seams open from my grandmother when I was a kid. But then I started switching to pressing them to the side because I heard that it makes it a little stronger, which makes sense. But ultimately what I do now is I make a decision based on the block. So if it wants to fold one way, I just kind of go with it. If I can, I usually will fold it over. However, if you have a very complex foundation paper piecing pattern with lots of places where lots of seams meet, it can get really bulky, and trying to fold it over, it will get so thick it'll be hard to quilt through. So if it's really thick, then I'll iron it out. Here's part 1 and part 2. Now we gotta sew on part 3. All right, so sewed on piece number 3, recorded the first time, realized I was out of bobbin thread, sewed it again, didn't record it. Here is our final result of our piece that was 3 sections. So you can see how we have this seam allowance in here, but when you sew it all together, it looks just like a 5 square block like the rest of them. If you download the next section of blocks, it'll be this one plus these 3, which I didn't show these 3 because they're using the same techniques that we've gone over in other videos. So if you follow me along up till now, this is where you should be. Stay tuned for the next video.